Imagine an explosion 100 million times more powerful than the largest nuclear weapon ever built. Within hours, the masters of the planet were erased, and a world that had lasted millions of years was gone. How did the most successful creatures in history vanish in a single day? And how did their catastrophe become the very reason you are here today, long before humans? Earth was a place of deep, ancient silence. During the Cretaceous period, the world was a wild, green masterpiece where life flourished in every corner. This was an era of colossi, inhabited by beings so massive they seemed designed by the gods themselves. Across sun-drenched plains, herds of Triceratops roamed through a world that had never known the bite of winter. In the heavens, pterosaurs with wings like sails cut through the air, while the oceans belonged to monsters of the abyss. On land, the undisputed ruler was the Tyrannosaurus rex, 2 tons of muscle and fang, driven by an instinct as old as the planet. This was a world perfect in its ferocity, where every heartbeat carried profound meaning. Herbivores grazed on endless forests of ferns, and predators moved with the rising sun. It was a state of pure power and balance. Yet, beneath this harmony, fate was already in motion. None of these magnificent creatures knew that their next breath would be among their last. High above the atmosphere, in the silent darkness of space, an ancient fragment was completing a journey millions of years in the making. Born from a violent collision between celestial bodies, this rock had crossed the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, silent and inevitable. Below, Earth remained blissfully unaware, continuing its slow rotation within a vibrant blue sky. On the surface, the planet was a theater of raw energy. Volcanic chains erupted in rivers of lava, sculpting the continents as the seasons drifted by. It was a world of constant motion where life adapted and multiplied, yet it remained profoundly vulnerable. In this immense universe, a single grain of space was hurtling toward us, and absolutely nothing could stand in its way. Across the northern plains, herds of ankylosaurs moved heavily, their bone armor glinting like living shields in the sun. To the south, hadrosaurs crossed wide rivers, their calls echoing through the valleys like ancient songs. In the swamps, swift compsognaths darted through the ferns, while more agile predators waited in the shadows. This was a world of immense growth, where insects carried pollen among new flowers, and the sky hummed with wings that had never known fear. High in the branches, the dark, shiny feathers of the microraptor glided through the trees. Beneath the roots, tiny mammals lived in the shadows, alert, wary, but ready for a future they did not yet know they possessed. It was a perfect, fragile balance suspended above an invisible abyss. After millions of miles, the asteroid entered Earth's gravitational field and accelerated. It swept past the moon's orbit, its path tilting directly toward the atmosphere. Ahead of it, the air began to compress and heat until the surface became incandescent. From the ground, a bright trail appeared in the sky, growing more intense every second. Then it became fire. A massive orb of flame hurtled at over 70,000 kilometers per hour. Its target was the Yucatan Peninsula, where the sea bends in a perfect arc. Beneath this impending shadow, the dinosaurs were experiencing their very last dawn. In those final seconds, the world fell into an eerie, suffocating stillness. No living creature looked up to the heavens, and none could truly comprehend the scale of the doom descending upon them. The sky began to shift into colors never before seen by prehistoric eyes, and the vibrant chorus of the forest suddenly vanished as the birds stopped their singing. The animals froze in place, as if the earth itself were holding its breath in anticipation of the coming strike. Then, the darkness was shattered by a light so intense it blotted out the sun, a flash that didn't just illuminate the day, but consumed it. A roar followed, a sound so titanic it had no echo, because it surpassed the very physics of sound itself. In that moment, time simply stood still. The asteroid crossed the final few kilometers of the atmosphere in less than a heartbeat, its wake igniting the air and lighting the planet like 1,000 suns. When it finally struck the Yucatan, the impact was cataclysmic. The sea didn't just move, it exploded upward, vaporizing instantly into a wall of steam and fire. The collision released an unimaginable amount of energy, equal to more than 100 million megatons. The Earth's crust, once thought to be solid and eternal, folded and rippled like a veil of sand. Rock melted instantly, and the sky was set ablaze as the planet's surface began to ignite. For thousands of kilometers in every direction, nothing survived the initial blast. A massive shockwave tore across the globe, moving with a ferocity that defied description. Ancient trees were bent like blades of grass before disappearing into ash, burned away by air that had turned into pure flame. In the oceans, the water rose into a terrifying wall, a tsunami more than a kilometer high that began its march across the world. Shards of molten rock and metal were hurled to the very edges of the atmosphere, turning the heavens into a source of lethal debris. This wave swept across the oceans, erasing coastlines thousands of kilometers away, with a power that left nothing behind. The seas rose and then retreated with a violent force, carrying the remnants of a lost world into the depths. In an instant, the planet had transformed into a single, agonizing howl of destruction. The initial cataclysm was only the beginning of the planet's transformation. As the tsunami retreated and the roar of the impact began to settle, the planet entered a state of pure, agonizing chaos. It had become a single global howl. But the destruction was far from over. High above the smoke-filled horizon, new fragments of light began to appear in the sky. These were the rocks and debris that had been hurled into space by the force of the collision, now returning to Earth as incandescent missiles. What began as thousands of tiny, shimmering stars falling through the newborn darkness quickly became a nightmare. These isolated flashes soon transitioned into an incessant, relentless rain of fire that blotted out any remaining sense of peace. For hours and then days, the atmosphere was bombarded by these falling embers. The day and night merged into one singular, terrifying inferno, where the concept of time seemed to vanish. The Earth was no longer the world the dinosaurs had dominated. The familiar blue sky was gone, replaced by a jagged wound of thick smoke and dancing flame. Each fragment that returned from space acted as a torch, igniting new fires and turning the landscape into vast, growing seas of flame. The great forests of the Cretaceous disappeared in a single, suffocating breath. Even the oceans offered no refuge. The water began to boil, sending up clouds of poisonous vapors that choked the horizon. There was no place to hide because the very air had turned to fire. Beneath the feet of the dying, the ground turned into liquid glass. As temperatures soared beyond 1,000 degrees, the entire planet was transformed into a massive furnace. Even the solid rocks beneath the surface began to deform, flowing across the landscape like melting wax. The flames raced beyond the horizon, driven by violent winds and the immense suffering of a world in its death throes. The largest and most majestic dinosaurs, the rulers of the land, began to collapse. They were not killed by predators, but were suffocated by the unbearable heat. Rivers that had sustained life for millions of years simply evaporated into thin air, and the clouds vanished into a dark, oppressive haze. The only sound that accompanied this destruction was the deep, rhythmic roar of earthquakes that shook the planet without pause. The Earth trembled relentlessly, and as if it were struggling to free itself from the weight of its own fate. At the center of this devastation was a massive, fresh wound, more than 20 kilometers deep and 180 kilometers wide. Though this crater would eventually be hidden beneath the sea, the scar was now forever etched into the bones of the Earth. Shockwaves from the impact continued to circle the globe multiple times, reflecting off mountains and crossing oceans in a continuous cycle of destruction. Each vibration acted as a scythe, erasing a forest here, a lake there, and taking the final breath of a creature somewhere else. In a matter of mere hours, entire ecosystems that had taken millions of years to evolve simply disappeared. The vibrant day had finally turned into an absolute, terrifying black. The vibrant world of the Cretaceous was gone, replaced by a suffocating, absolute darkness. In the wake of the fire, a new and terrible silence settled over the planet, broken only by the sound of falling ash. This was not the gentle snow of a winter morning. It was a dense, gray dust that began to blanket every inch of the Earth's surface. It settled heavily upon the cooling seas, upon the charred remains of ancient forests, and upon the still open eyes of the fallen giants. This was the dust of the end, a physical shroud for a world that had been erased in a single day. Yet, even as the surface of the planet burned and the sky remained choked with soot, life did not entirely vanish. Beneath the layers of ash and destruction, in the hidden places of the world, something incredible was happening. Deep underground, within the mud of riverbeds, and inside the safety of hollowed-out tree trunks, small lives were resisting the end of the world. These were the forgotten creatures, the insects, the amphibians, and the tiny mammals that had lived for millions of years in the literal and figurative shadows of the dinosaurs. No one had ever looked at these creatures as the masters of the earth.
The impact
Yet they were the
crater,
ones
though
who
later
possessed the
hidden by
resilience
sea,
to endure,
is etched into
while the giants
bones of the
collapsed
earth.
because they had nowhere to hide from the heat and the hunger. These smaller beings sought refuge in burrows and holes between the rocks. In that absolute, terrifying darkness, the heart of
Each
the future
vibration
began to
acts
beat.
as a scythe,
It was a pulse of life
erasing
that was
forests
small,
and taking
hidden,
the final
and
breaths
determined.
of survivors.
The catastrophe, however,
Entire
was far from over.
ecosystems that
The
took
immense volume
millions
of dust and
years to
debris
evolve
raised by the impact
vanish
did
in
not
a
simply
matter of
fall back to
hours.
Earth. Much of it remained suspended in the atmosphere for months, and eventually years. This shroud was so thick that it completely blocked the light of the sun, causing day and night to blur into a single eternal twilight. Without the sun's warmth, the planet's heat began to disperse into the cold vacuum of space, and temperatures across the globe plummeted. The winds no longer carried the scent of flowers or the humidity of the swamps. Instead, they carried ash, sulfur, and the chill of death. For the life that remained on the surface, the greatest challenge was only just beginning. Because the sun could no longer reach the ground, the most fundamental process of life, photosynthesis, simply stopped. The plants, deprived of their source of energy, began to wither and die one after another. This collapse of the green world sent a ripple of starvation through the entire food chain. The herbivores, which had once roamed in majestic herds, found nothing left to eat in the frozen darkness. As they fell, the predators that relied on them were not far behind. The age of the giants was being brought to a slow, cold, and merciless conclusion. The fall of the giants did not happen in a single afternoon. Instead, it was a slow, merciless unfolding of time, where the once vibrant earth became a frozen tomb. The Tyrannosaurus rex, a creature that had reigned for millions of years with undisputed power, was now reduced to a ghost in a graveyard of its own making. It roamed through the blackened remains of charred forests, searching for even the smallest morsel of meat to satisfy a hunger that could no longer be met. The majestic herds of Triceratops, which once moved with the grace of living fortresses, were now broken. They wandered alone through the ash, their movements slow and heavy, as the cold sapped the life from their massive frames. Hunger consumed them. The freezing temperatures bent them, and eventually, one by one, the giants fell for the last time. This silence reached even the deepest parts of the world's oceans. The liquid world, once teeming with life and monstrous predators, was now a place of suffocating, liquid silence. As the sunlight failed to penetrate the thick layers of atmospheric ash, the microscopic algae, the very foundation of the marine food chain, began to vanish. Without them, the entire delicate structure of the sea collapsed. The ancient sea monsters that had ruled the depths for eons disappeared, unable to survive in a world where the life-giving energy of the sun had been extinguished. Every species on the planet took a last step, drew a last breath, and offered a final look at a world that no longer recognized them. The Earth, which had once been full of voice and energy, now breathed only the gray, suffocating ash of its own destruction. Yet, beneath this thick blanket of gray, the first heart of the future was quietly beating. Deep in the darkness of the soil and the cracks of the rocks, life was waiting. Years turned into decades. Slowly, the heavy dust that had strangled the atmosphere began to settle back to the ground. For the first time in a generation, the sun's light filtered through the clouds of death, at first weak and pale, but persistent. As the ice began to melt, a new world started to reveal itself. It was a world without dinosaurs, a silent canvas waiting for a new story to be written. The transition began with a single breath of wind. A light breeze crossed the desolate gray plains, lifting the ash like particles of gold dust in the returning light. The sun, though distant and pale, finally began to warm the scarred surface of the earth once more. Then came the rain. The first drops washed away the blackened soil, carrying moisture deep into the earth where forgotten seeds had been lying, in a state of suspended animation. Against all logic and in defiance of the devastation, those seeds began to sprout. Life returned in its most fragile and timid forms. Moss began to cling to the rocks, and ferns unsure curled among the stumps of the burnt forests. Tiny flowers opened their petals to the new light, signaling that the earth was breathing again. The era of the giants had passed, but the dance of life was far from over.